still has measures of quality, measures of robustness, and I'll talk about those as we go through. But I think if you guys are like sitting back and listening to this lecture, what you're gonna get out of it, the best thing you're gonna get out of it, is to basically see the logic behind how I've put together these methods, how I've tried to recreate the purpose of it and use methods to build up from the bottom. All right, that said, I have structured this project in 3 parts, and the presentation essentially follows those parts. We're gonna start at the biggest scale, and then we're gonna work our way down. And we're ultimately gonna reveal those connections between big picture issues of spatial justice and social equity, down to very specific issues, which I'm focusing on public space, but on what I call third spaces, or really what Ray Oldenburg called third places that I am kind of re-leveraging the concept of. So I have an excerpt of an interview here, because it highlights the inspiration for the title of my talk, where a researcher, Santosh, is interviewing one of the adolescents, and the adolescent says, "I don't have any place to play." And I thought that was especially important because out of the 42 adolescents that I worked with over the course of this study, when I was coding the interviews, can you guys hear me okay now? Cool, okay. Designer jackets and fake pockets, darn. All right, so we're going back to this little quote, talking with one of the kids, Manish, and he says there's no place to play. And I named the title of this project, No Place to Play, because when I was working with these 42 adolescents, that was the most frequently used phrase across all of the interviews, no place to play. And that was at odds. There was a lot of tension between what they said and what I, as a designer and an architect, was actually looking at in the plans. When I looked at the plans of these communities, there were large open areas of agricultural land. There were trees, there were city parks within the 300-meter walking distance as prescribed by the UN's Child-Friendly Cities Initiative. So what was happening? Why were most of the 42 adolescents that I worked with saying, hey, we don't have any place that we can actually play, but the designer, the practitioner in me, was reviewing the documents and finding, well, yeah, you do. So what's going on in between there? I think what happened is that the kids felt like those places, the open agricultural fields, the public parks, those places were not safe, they weren't comfortable, they weren't convenient, and they weren't equitable. So in the lens of the children, they really just didn't exist overall. And I think that's essentially the importance of this study, is how can we start to really understand and develop a lens for how children see the environment, and how can we incorporate that better into our architecture, into our plans, and our designs. So I'm using words, I'm talking to people and listening to their stories. That should tell you guys that this is an inductive study. It's qualitative at its heart. So I didn't start with a direct hypothesis where I set out to prove or disprove something. Instead, I started with this general idea of an investigation. And in this case, I was asking, how do neoliberal urban policies influence poor communities? And from there, with that focus, I started doing some pilot research. I started talking to people. I started observing places and really drilling down. I think, to me, that's kind of the most exciting or exhilarating, if research can actually be like exhilarating, that's where it is for me. Because I feel like it must be like an archaeologist on a dig, where you have knowledge, so you kind of know what to look for. And you find a cool, interesting stone on the ground, and you just start working at it. And you start like uncovering it, and you're digging, and then 6 years later, maybe you have like the femur of a T-Rex, right? Or in my case, some cool findings about public space overall. So the project is cut into 3 slices. The first slice is my really big picture understanding. It's where I ground the project in theory overall. And then from that first part, I use the results to build my second piece. That's when I've uncovered enough to know what I need to do next. And then from the second part, I open up and uncover the third piece, each time drilling down, down, down in more specificity. So part 2, I start to look at how adolescents actually use those spaces. I found in part 1 that the focus on neoliberal urban policies led me to a very specific type of policy, development forced dispossession. And I found a connection between that policy and the well-being of adolescents, or I suspected it. And then in part 3, I stepped back and I used my architects and my practitioner mindset to then analyze those places that adolescents were using. And so we're going to go through, and I'm going to talk in more detail about that over the course of the project. So I started this project, though, by selecting cities to work with, and of course that required some initial preparatory research. One of my committee members, Jason Hackworth, he wrote a book that was pretty well received. It's called The Neoliberal City. And so he's kind of known as being like a practicing urban planner and understanding the physical implications, the like tangible on-the-ground things of urban policies, but mostly in American cities. But he helped me kind of guide, develop a list of neoliberal policies, start to understand who are the actors, who are the developers, the banks, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, who are the designers, the AECOM, the Bechtels of the world that are engaged in this process, in this cycle. And so I essentially came up with a list of places that had really hot projects, that had really sexy, intense neoliberal policies with like really stark histories behind them. And then from there, I kind of drilled down to look for development projects that really showcased all the stakes that were involved. I think if I were like just trying to claim or be a scientist, I would probably stop there. But I want to give you guys a reality check that when you are doing work with people, especially interviewing people in person, your position always matters, right? Positionality is a really big part of it. And I can't take away the fact that, or resolve the fact that I am a white American woman coming into these communities. So that was another huge part of the selection of cases. I had to figure out where I would be received in a way that was conducive to providing me with good data, right? And where my position might cause conflict. So I ended up, after reviewing all of these cities and projects and actors, and then kind of assessing my positionality, I ended up looking at Manila, Philippines, and Hyderabad in India as my 2 case study cities. Now, there is some natural comparability between the 2, but I think the way I would probably couch how I did this study is more of a sequential study where I started in the Philippines and then went to India to see what themes were transferable between the 2. So I did a lot of direct comparison of the cases in each of the cities, the communities that I worked with. But as far as the transnational, I was more looking for what themes carried across and which ones didn't, so that I could then make those overall connections at the larger, the bigger, the systematic level. Once I had identified the cities, then I started my dig, right? I set up my course. And I started looking for specific projects and communities that had been dispossessed by the projects. So I'm looking at post-dispossession, communities after they had been gentrified or resettled or even erased altogether off the map. So I did that by moving to these cities. I took a job with Save the Children Australia. They placed me in Manila. I became a research advisor, architect, kind of designer. I worked on a different project. It was called Building Children's Urban Resilience Against the Shocks and Threats of Resettlement. But what it did for my research was it allowed me access. it allowed me access to a huge list and inventory of communities where there were really long histories and relationships, positive relationships between those communities and Save the Children. So I wasn't coming in just as a random person off the street. I was coming in kind of backed by a reputation that was really positive and beneficial. I spent about 2 years overall in the Philippines. I also moved to Hyderabad, India, and spent a similar amount of time there. I didn't have the same job opportunity in Hyderabad, but I did have some job connections in which I was able to live with a developer that was actually working in a special economic zone. And by living with the developer, I got access to a lot of the projects there, a lot of the other developers and contractors, the designers, and then slowly over time, and it was really slow, guys. It was like, I was probably there for like 3 to 6 months in Hyderabad, trying to set up meetings and talking with people and then getting denied every time. So I spent a lot of my time focusing on the literature review and really like developing my backing. It just takes sometimes people a while to trust and to get to know you. It takes going to meetups. It takes going to organizational things over and over again, and then to see you and you to have experiences together before they're really willing to like open up their project and allow you in. So I think it's a really critical part overall of what I was able to do. I first identified the projects, and then again, I picked the communities that I worked with. I ended up working overall with 7 dispossessed communities. I think though, rather than trying to give you guys like a history or an understanding of the project and how the dispossession happened for all 7 communities, I'm just gonna talk to you about one. And I'm really not even going to talk to you so much about the project as the human consequences of how that dispossession was felt. Because ultimately when I'm talking to people and I'm trying to get their story, that was the main point. The main point was that this dispossession has consequences that are felt differently from the people dispossessed versus the actors doing the dispossession. For one side, for the developers, for the government, it's more of a business transaction and it stops at 5 o'clock. But for the people that are being acted on, that are being pushed out or squeezed in or erased altogether, this is their day-to-day lives. And so I want to just pick up with a story, actually. I'm going to talk to you about one of the communities in the greater Metro Manila of the Philippines. So that, I mean, most of you guys are very aware of that area, but it's super dense, probably like even the densest area in the world. And there's a specific suburb of Manila called Quezon City. And Quezon City is really interesting from a planning perspective because a lot of the land in Quezon City was actually owned by the government after World War II. It got really decimated in World War II, and a lot of the land ended up transitioning to the government, and through a series of like political processes, you know, the presidents were essentially like, hey, we've got all this open land, and we've got a lot of people migrating to Manila from these from these rural islands where there were, you know, post-colonial forces at play. And what do? And they leveraged all of this open land and essentially invited people to reside on it. And that, in effect, seeded some of the world's largest, today, informal communities or slums, right? So today, though, these informal communities or these slums, as the city is growing, and they need more area to develop, the city's saying, well, hey, those people don't actually have the property right to be there, even though it could be argued that they were invited there by the government. They don't technically hold ownership. So that land should be used for development projects. That land has speculative potential. So let's develop that. So the government ended up dispossessing or taking that land from a lot of the people and indoctrinating them into what's called a resettlement campaign. Taking inventory, taking population surveys, and then physically relocating people into social housing projects that were typically a lot farther outside of the city. And that's where I really decided to focus in on, was this process of dispossession, the taking of land, not necessarily though for traditional reasons, right? How many of you guys have heard of like eminent domain or land acquisition, right? So those are kind of familiar terms. But those typically remind us of like a dam project or the building of a highway, right? Typically that's something where there's like a public good involved. So generally throughout history we see that when a government takes land from private individuals, it's because they're justifying it based on the good of society overall. But development forced dispossession is different, because development forced dispossession is when land is taken specifically for business development. It's taken for a shopping mall or for a special economic zone or like an IT campus or something like that. And the general logic is that, well, that is a public good because it's going to create more jobs. But the critique is that, well, who are the jobs for? Are the jobs for the lower income residents that are traditionally the ones displaced? And I think there can be really good examples, but in this case, there was such an extreme, stark example of the haves taking the land and developing it specifically for a middle and upper class development, and the haves not being pushed farther out, that it was really hard to see it anything other than a cycle of reproduction, right? Than a cycle of reproducing an urban poor population. So my dissertation ultimately focuses on this very specific type of dispossession. I'm going to call it DFD because it's like pretty wordy. And I'm going to look at how these development projects pushed these communities out, and specifically how kids in those communities use public space. So I'm going to go back to the story, and I'm going to tell you this very human and personal story of Sitio San Roque in Quezon City. And I'm going to focus in on a time that I think the conflict was like the most intense. A particular moment, the daybreak of September 23rd, 2010, so about 10 years ago, where 9,000 families gathered in the morning, and they were gathering, anxiously waiting for demolition crews to come start dismantling the homes that they were living in. Because that was the day that the government said, you've had an opportunity to voluntarily move on your own, we're now going to do it for you. And it's really important for you to understand why those people weren't moving. Hey, they were given an option. Well, what was the option really? So I did an interview with Elmer, and I feel like his logic, his decision-making really captures what a lot of the people that were standing out there that day felt. So Elmer essentially considered the offers. He liked the idea of having a house of his own, but offer one was essentially to return to his former home. Now this is problematic because Elmer's family had actually been living in that area for 2 generations. So his former home was his ancestral home. He didn't actually have physical ties where he felt comfortable going back to. And it was a $540 one-time cash payment. Hey, get on a plane or a boat or whatever, leave and don't come back. We'll pay you to do that because land in the city is too important for economic development right now. The second option, though, was a one-time payment of $135 to resettle to this faraway community called Montalban, which is in the province of Rizal. Now, that's really far outside the city. It's like probably a 3 to 4 hour drive if you have a private car. Of course, Elmer doesn't have a private car, but there's no public transportation. There's no jobs. He had never actually been there. There was no way to see what it looked like or what he was accepting. And also, there weren't any jobs. There weren't any jobs, there wasn't any power, there wasn't any water. So he didn't really feel like that was an option because Elmer wasn't thinking just for himself. Elmer was thinking of the 5 children he was supporting and the mother-in-law that he had at home, and the only job that he knew, which was to drive a tricycle in downtown Manila, which is like a little auto, right? A type of taxi, that he earned daily wages from that his family subsisted on. They didn't have the savings that you and I might have. to be able to make a large move. They didn't have the perspective of being able to make that jump. Additionally, the houses in Montalban, they weren't free. They were a 30-year mortgage. So not only was he questioning whether he had the livelihood opportunity to be able to make it happen, but also he didn't know if he was going to be able to make the payment and keep the house longer term. So Elmer and most of those people, all 9,000 of those people, they did not consider that as actually being an option. So they put everything they had into defending their homes as they stood. They piled sofas, they piled concertina wire across the highway next to their community in order to stop traffic, because their theory was, if we can get the attention of the middle class, the people commuting, we might be able to stop this. But police arrived. First, there was a group of 200. Then there was a group of 300. Then a SWAT team showed up. Then a fire engine with a water cannon showed up to wipe people off. And the only reason, even though 14 people were injured, the only reason that it actually stopped was because the police and the SWAT team and the fire department employees got off work at 4 o'clock. At 4 o'clock, everybody stopped and they went home, except the people whose homes had already been damaged. So again, on one side, it's very much a business matter, but on the other side, you have people that are fighting because their access to the city is their access to survival. Now, there is a little bit of hope to this whole story. One of the organizers in the community, Lyndsey Velarde, she had been heard by the courts in the local community, and that actually got a reprieve for 2 days to halt the demolition. And I think it also created some additional hope for her overall community that maybe something could be done. And it ended up that Lucia was able to kind of negotiate with the National Housing Authority to have some say in how her house was designed, and they got to actually take a site visit to see the location. And they were able to point out to the government that Montalban Rizal was not appropriate and that it was going to be too much of a hardship. So the NHA acquiesced, and they allowed them to pick a site still 3 hours away, but with a little more infrastructure developed, called Garden Village. And my research picks up by following Velarde and her community, 700 other families, as they made this move out to Garden Village. But it's important to keep in mind the context that Velarde actually only was able to make life better for 700 families. That's like 8% of the overall Sitio San Roque. For 92% others, their built-up hopes were eventually dashed 3 days later when the demolition crews and the SWAT team and the police and the fire trucks came back and started working again on demolishing their houses. So today, the former site of Sitio San Roque, you can kind of see I've taken images from the developers' presentations up on the right. That's what they planned Sitio San Roque to be converted into. It's a shopping mall featuring live, work, play amenities for the middle and upper classes. That's all part of a public-private partnership with a company called Ayala Land Corporation. And so you can see there's high-density towers, and then at the bottom you see that there are 3 time images of Sitio San Roque area receding as the demolition crews make progress and these residents' land is dispossessed from them. So I sat down with Velarde in 2018 and I talked to her about, hey, how was it? I talked to you before you had moved, now you think you've had some success, you've moved and started Garden Village. What was that like? And she said, you know, Lyndsey, it was hard. Actually, we still didn't have water or power for 2 months. Most people are having trouble finding a job because it's in an agricultural area. So a lot of us leave our kids here and we go back to the city and we live there all week and then we come back on the weekend. And I processed this information and I couldn't help it. I told you guys in the beginning, I'm a practitioner. And I kept thinking like, man, these pictures of these high-rise towers, you've got high-density living already there. Why didn't you guys try to work out a deal with the NHA to stay on your site, you know? Like, why couldn't there be a small part of it that was incorporated? And I was really surprised because Velarde got like heated. You know, her face got flushed. She kind of like, her shoulders kind of bounced, and she was like, I did, Lyndsey. I tried that already. And she said she felt like it was discrimination. Her quote was, but how could we live in a building like that? It was discrimination. They said, meaning the NHA, that we didn't belong to the social class that deserved to live in such a development. Now, full disclosure, I'm a former federal civil service architect. I was like, really? I feel like this is more like a Disney movie or something where there's like some sort of a villain. Surely the government didn't actually think that, right? Like maybe that was the impression she got, but how could that possibly be true? But as shocking as her quote may sound, that narrative actually aligns with the stories that I was able to uncover about what the NHA reported. Francisco Alacon, who is the area deputy manager of the National Housing Authority, essentially said, of course there's resistance. The residents want to stay here, but the government can't get in. It's a prime lot. It's intended for commercial ventures. And so I thought about it and said, again, still, I need to know more. So I actually went to the city of Quezon, and I interviewed city planners. I interviewed a development officer. I interviewed 2 architects. And I said, what's happening, guys? Why can't you figure out a way? You know that these people need access to the city. They need access to the public amenities and the services. What's the friction that's happening? And they got so excited. I was really surprised. I'm always surprised how, in general, how easy it is to talk to people. People want to tell you their story, especially when you're open. And they were like, you know what, come back. We're gonna show you how we can do it so good. And they drove me around to this community called Bisticville 2. It's really cool. It's won all sorts of like awards. Development organizations are using it as a pilot. It's got mixed income living, so there's low income social housing, there's middle social housing, and there's some higher income. It's got community center play spaces. Instead of it just being like the homogeneous, same single social house that's like standard design, it's got like 4 or 5 different typologies that are mixed in. It's very cool, very well done. But guess what happened? At the end of it, the architects, when I said, well, why can't you do this for the people at Sitio San Roque? They kind of like shirked back in their chair and they were like, it's so hard. This project only got through because it was a pilot. It was a special case. In fact, the only way it penciled out to our development team was that we got a special grant, a special donation. So even though we're using this as an example of what we know we need to do and we need to provide people, we just can't make it work from an economic standpoint. It's not penciling out, right? And so that's essentially where I start looking at DFD as a neoliberal process. Because even though there's knowledge, we know what to do differently, even though there are examples of what to do differently, it always came down to how the project penciled out, right? How the financial standing of the project ran. And I would like to kind of offer you guys some architectural insight as well. That maybe the penciling out is not such an after effect, but maybe it's quite premeditated, that maybe this type of exclusivity where lower income communities are resettled to leave space for middle and higher income communities is actually part of the product that's being sold. So let's think of it as like the image of exclusivity, like exclusive architecture. Because these developments have very premeditated architectural intentions. And I think that this billboard, which is right outside one of the communities I worked with in India called Nanakram Gouda, really just like epitomizes the whole theory. And you can see the development back here with like screening, you can see the concertina wire and the gated walls. Essentially, the advertisement of this community, the developers, are really saying, hey, we'll make it possible for you to kind of forget that there's anything else, and we're going to make it really exclusive. That's what you're buying. You're paying for the ability to have this kind of prefabricated world in which your public space is not really public, it's just public within your class, within your group. And that's what the residents, that's right now what the market is pushing for. That's what people are demanding. Why? Because there's a lot of connections between that idea of safety, comfort, convenience, as you're able to control the environment in such a way. So this, forget the rest of the world advertisement of Alekia Homes, it's essentially advertising and acknowledging that, hey, we are dispossessing the residents of this village who have lived here for over 400 years with no other place to play, with no access to the public spaces within those buildings, though. What happens to the people, the kids that actually live there? And that's essentially what I wanted to look at in my project. I think both the story of Sitio San Roque, the billboard that you saw at Alekia Homes, they are highlighting this kind of persistent problem that I think is a problem at a global level. It's a transnational issue that as competition for space is heating up, city governments are under a lot of financial pressure to prioritize the economic benefits of development over all other costs when they're making planning decisions. And I'm gonna just hit you one more time with some evidence that it's not only important and it's big picture important and philosophically important, but there's policy changes that are happening or that have happened in 2018 that are incredibly shocking. So the World Bank, which the World Bank is kind of like the leader premier bank for our development banks. A lot of the regional banks copy the policies of the World Bank. And the World Bank used to, as they would fund these types of projects, these public-private partnerships, these types of developments, they used to have language in there. Michael Cernia, who is a sociologist and used to be the World Bank's advisor on how their projects would affect communities, he had this list of requirements, and the requirements included a social impact statement, an environmental impact statement, and some language that essentially said, you've got to be able in your project to ensure that the people impacted by the project have a reasonable expectation of congruence, that their before and after experience isn't gonna be just completely horrible. Except in 2018, they rolled back that requirement. And they said, let's leave it up to the project, to the lendee, to police themselves. We'll make it a best practice. We think you should do it, but we're not going to actually require it anymore. And so I'm kind of asking you guys today to think about if the bank lenders are not requiring any sort of social impact assessment or comparison, how are we going to ensure that the projects don't always assume or always take economic benefits as their priority? As these exclusive architectures encroach and start to replace these lower income communities in our inner cities through the DFD processes, those powers of land speculation are essentially driving segregated public space or changing the concept of public space so that it doesn't necessarily mean public for everybody, it means public for your economic class. And so the result is that a lot of the communities that are dispossessed end up being crowded, unsafe, hostile spaces. And that challenges the environments that kids usually use. And I think it's most important to kids and their ability to access public space. Why? We know that women and children are more seriously affected by a decline in the quality of their built environment more than any other group. And we also know that low-income adolescents in particular are susceptible to developmental risks if their access to public space is inhibited. The criticality of public space for adolescents' development is really firmly established. There have been several scholars that have documented this. And such access is so dire that the UN even has, in their Sustainable Development Goals, exclusively called out the need for children to have safe, inclusive, accessible, public, and green spaces. So it should be noted that to date, though, when we're talking about social and spatial justice, the age dimension, it's surprising, has kind of been left out. especially when you get into conversations that involve neoliberal policies and architecture. I will have to say, like, in my department, I'm kind of like the red-headed stepchild, for example, because I'm working on kids studies, and it's not really seen as being important to the bigger ideological conversations where people are rooting in Lefebvre and David Harvey, and they're wanting to talk about how neoliberalism is making progress. But I argue, actually, kids and their perspective gives us a really unusual insight, because kids don't have a vote. Kids are not usually acknowledged or seen as practicing members, but yet they're the ones that depend on it most. So they give us a really unusual way to perceive this overall global dimension. And kids, especially at the age of adolescence, so that's where I'm narrowing in on, 12 to 16-year-olds. Now you should note, adolescence is kind of culturally defined. You know, in one culture it might be a little younger, it might be a little older. For my purposes, 12 to 16 was right. Kids at that age, that adolescent age, they're the ones that need the public space the most, because they're the ones that are testing out their identities. They're the ones that are watching other people and observing how people in society actually act. They're also practicing socializing. That's what people do in the spaces outside of their homes, outside of their schools. So if cities are continuing to adopt these neoliberal policies, they're using DFD as a best practice to fund their development mechanisms, my research question essentially pushes down and becomes, how are we going to allow kids of all income groups to have access to public space that's truly public, to be able to carry out these behaviors in these spaces if they don't exist in the same way? So by investigating the absence and or low quality public spaces in dispossessed communities, my goal was to kind of move the discourse forward about DFD's role in promoting inequality past what's kind of generally apparent to very specific instances of public space in the built environment. Now, I'm not like completely crazy, maybe in some ways, but not in this, in that there's been other scholars that are really well known that have kind of made connections between kids and youth studies and big things like capitalism or post-capitalism. So like a few that are really notable are Cindy Katz's project. She's more anthropology, but she essentially looked at like kids in South Sudan and their consumerism and like New York City, and she was able to draw some like really cool connections between the two using like an ethnographic approach. But there's even people within like our worlds, like planning and architecture. You've got Kevin Lynch, of course everybody knows, right? Kevin Lynch, Image of the City. Well, guess what? He also wrote a really amazing study called Growing Up in the City, where he did a transnational multi-case study on how adolescents use public space in like 6 or 8 different countries. Now that was done in like 1977-ish. And so there was a follow-up to it at the turn of the century by Dr. Louise Chawla called Growing Up Global, in which she then looks at similar areas in cities and adolescents and looks at how the impact of globalization. But one of the big changes that Dr. Chawla did is she said, hey, Kevin, we know that adolescence are a really important perspective, but really it's the lower income kids that need the space the most. So she switched the study. It's a follow-on. It's funded by the UN. But her focus is going to be a little bit more on low-income kids. And I feel like this project builds upon what they've established by saying it's not just low-income kids, it's also low-income kids in dispossessed communities. There you go. So for part 1 of my project, I essentially identified the specific projects, and then I was able to identify these 7 dispossessed communities to work with. And as a qualitative project, I selected the communities by looking overall for diversity. So DFD works through both formal and informal mechanisms. So my kind of case study approach was to compare the format, not to compare the formal versus the informal mechanisms, but acknowledge that there's a spectrum, and then select areas that were along this spectrum so that I got like a really wide glimpse of how the process was working overall. So in the Philippines, it was a little easier for me to pick cases because, like I said, I was working for Save the Children, and I was like, hey, I need to know where can I find these resettled or dispossessed communities, and they're like, oh, here's a list of 1,000. Do you want to just start like doing site visits? How do you want to handle it? It was pretty straightforward. There was a lot of paperwork, there was a lot of documentation, there were maps, there were registration cards, there were population counts. So what I did is say, well, what's the biggest influence to the architecture and planning of these resettlement communities? Well, it turns out that there's a state regulation called BP 220 that guides the size, the form, how much public space should be in a resettlement community. But that had updates to it. And so what I did is I picked 4 communities that were developed in different periods that this guide had been updated. So I could see how the changes in the architectural code and regulation actually impacted the users of the community. Now in India, it was a little difficult. It was a lot difficult, if I'm being honest, because there was no formality to the resettlement process. In fact, I would argue that a lot of the communities weren't really resettled. The government came in and said, hey, we've got an idea. We're under a lot of pressure to compete with other cities in India, specifically Bangalore. And what we'd like to do is build the biggest, the brightest, the shiniest IT and finance hub that the world has ever offered. It's going to be super cool. We're going to put in like a metro rail and everything. And they did this by looking at a map, finding where they felt like there was a lot of open space, and then using those kind of land acquisition, eminent domain mechanisms in order to establish a special economic zone to give tax breaks to companies that could come in. They were trying to entice them. Hey, Google, hey, Amazon, come in, use our land, develop it. The challenge was that there were 18 villages, but culturally, these villages didn't have property rights. And I would argue, if you do like any kind of historical digging, even if you just like really scratch the surface, they didn't have property rights because most of the people in these communities were minorities. They were lower caste, they were of a different religion, and they hadn't really actually been able to technically own property up until the last 20 years. So even though the record of occupation goes back centuries, they didn't actually hold title cards. And so therefore, according to the government, they didn't exist. So I had to do some research, find these 18 villages, but then where did they go, right? Because right now, if you go there, it's just Amazon headquarters, which is kind of funny because the Amazon headquarters is a LEED Platinum building. And I think it's a little interesting that it's connoted to be like this very sustainable building and complex, and yet it's located on dispossessed land that was taken. Well, you can imagine the government doesn't want the story going around that land was taken. So a lot of the communities were just completely erased. I couldn't find any record. I interviewed all sorts of people. I interviewed a lot of scholars who had been in the area, people who had done work, and had a difficult time finding it. But eventually, I found about 6. And then from those, I found 3 that were willing to talk to me. So you can see, these are the different communities in the Philippines over the course of period of time, representing the different stages of BP 220. And then here are 3 communities in the outskirts of Hyderabad, in this area called Hyderabad. 2 of them had been squeezed in. So they weren't really even resettlements. They were more like the people remaining in Sitio San Roque. They were defending their space and pushing back. One of them, though, had taken a deal, but it was an under-the-table deal with a politician who had a bunch of family property way outside the city and said, you know what, if you guys will stop making problems so that I can get this business deal to go through, I'll just give you some land that you can live on. And so that's where this kind of, I don't know if you'd call it resettlement as much as forced displacement overall. Before I worked with the adolescents, before I started to work with the kids though, I really wanted to become familiar with the communities and their residents and their spatialities and start to build those relationships. So I had been living in the area, so I was able to make a lot of frequent trips. And I really talked to the elders and I got to know their overall stories. And then I also started to conduct different types of surveys, and I did a lot of on-the-ground mapping, a lot of photography, a lot of elevations and frontages. I used ultimately GIS to kind of plug everything in and do some comparisons. And you can see, I really like figure ground diagrams because they give you a feel of the densities of these different places. And you can really see the impact of BP 220 in the top 4 because they're very orthogonal, they're very regulated. And then you can see in the bottom the influence of the encroachment on these communities because they're much more grassroots in their structure. But in working with the kids, I used that inductive approach. I leveraged methods and concepts from environmental psychology, such as affordances, like what behaviors does the built environment afford, and congruence, how well does the person's expectation match up with the actual environment. And like using Ray Oldenburg's concept of third places, I used it because I was essentially just asking a pretty simple question. Hey kids, where do you guys hang out, right? Where do you like socialize? But what I wanted to do was eliminate home and eliminate school, because those are pretty structured environments. And so I was trying to basically figure out what's a term that I could use to caveat the space in between that. And so I thought that Ray Oldenburg's concept of third place, where he defines, home is 1 and work is 2, it was reused in adolescent studies by Gardner, where she said home is 1 and school is 2. And so I'm going to look at those hangout spaces or those third spaces. And what I found after talking to the kids is they don't actually hang out in the parks, in the formal areas, but they're hanging out in like the connective tissue of the community, mainly because a lot of those parks, a lot of those formal spaces were commandeered by power structures in the community and not really accessible to them. They weren't safe, comfortable, convenient. So I used a bunch of different methods in each community. I started at the focus group level, and then I kind of figured out what the major themes were, and I used that to select and recruit participants. And then I developed my criteria for actually interviewing the kids. I recruited adolescents based on just the principle of diversity. I was looking for diversity of gender orientations, of age range between 12 and 16. I was also trying to make sure that I didn't represent, like, typically when you're going out and looking for voluntary participants, it's the people that are like, for lack of a better word, like the good kids that are actually going to show up, right? Because they're the ones that are going to show up. Their parents want them to be there, et cetera. So I had to work really hard to find out, like, where are the kids that have dropped out of school, right? Where are the kids that are working full time? Where are the kids who have different life experiences than you might typically think? And that was really hard. And it was also hard on the communities because the communities didn't want to show off. They wanted to show a very particular narrative, right? The communities, when I came in and said, hey, I'm going to do this project, they were like, oh, sure, here's our top 5 students. You can write about how all these students are really great and smart. And I had to say, no, I'm looking for a realistic. I had to go door to door and start to try to ask people, right? Of course, I did that with the help of Save the Children and my local research team. I hired a huge team, and I would love to talk to you guys more about the craziness involved with hiring a slew of different researchers and perspectives and having a large team and working in an international context. We conducted the study in 6 different languages, so they were primarily there to help me translate and transcribe the interviews as we conducted them all in local language. But because this was my dissertation, I was present at every interview, and I personally coded all the data and analyzed all the data. That said, I don't actually think that was a good idea. And not just because it took me almost a year to get through it all. I think I had like over 200 hours of just audio recordings of interviews to actually slug through. But coding the data, I think you get better quality when you have 2 independent coders, and then they both say, hey, we also found something funny on line 7. Then you have like more justification. So I would just caution you, even though my route, well, my committee said this is how you have to do it because they were rating me, I think big picture, if I were to do it again, I would hire an independent coder to actually cross-check what I was doing. So I typically followed, in the second part of the study, a process where I started with an interview, I had it translated, then I analyzed it, And then I used those findings as a basis for the second interview. So I did 3 interviews over the course of a few months with each kid. In the second interview, I added a mixture of methods to help the kids find their voice. That's really important because a lot of times when you're working with kids, most of them don't want to talk to you, but they'll show you or they'll draw it or they'll take a picture of it. You have to make it fun, right? So I gave them a disposable camera, which, by the way, I think is a horrible method right now. Because have you ever tried to get disposable camera film developed in a reasonable amount of time? It's horrible, especially if you're like, out in, rural areas, especially of India. We had to send our film off to Bangalore. It would take 2 weeks before we get it back. It would delay the whole project. So I would be careful with that if that's a method. Once we had the second interview translated, the photos were developed eventually, and I was able to code and analyze the data a second time. I went back for a third meeting. That's part of the good rigor of the study. Having multiple meetings, cross-checking the data, asking the kids, you kind of rephrase what you learned, and you're like, oh, so I understand that this is a scary place, right? And if they're like, oh, no, it's not, then you know, it's interesting. Last time you said it was scary. Has something happened? Were you just in a mood, or is that how you actually feel? Is that a normal perception for you? I also gave them really large format maps. So we sat on the ground, we did a lot of fun activities, we had stickers and colors, and I would ask them questions like, is this place, how do you get to school, and why, and where do you feel safe, and who actually goes there, and who do you talk to on social media, and where do they live? So I started learning about all these different connections that they were having with their community. And I feel like these narratives were especially critical to get at the reasons that most adolescents actually selected. So I'm looking for their perspective, the rationale behind it. And I felt like there's kind of like 2 broad themes that arose from it. One of them is that almost all the kids in all the communities voiced safety concerns and suggested that they all operated under a climate of fear. Fear dictated most of where they went. And then I also found that gender was a huge component. The difference between the spatial ranges and the spatialities of those who identified as girls and those who identified as boys was in direct contrast with each other. Site selection, activities, behaviors. Now, there were a lot of themes, though, that you really can't transfer transnationally. So I wanted to just give you an idea. Of course, we can go into more discussion of it later. But in the Philippines, I worked with about 50 adolescents. I think there were like 58 in my focus group, and then another 16 that I did in-depth interviews with. And we did all of those different, photo voice, participant-directed mapping, iterative interviews. And I found that the adolescents' activities were dictated by themes of territory, themes of the typical route they went on, what social group they hung out with, what spaces were perceived as girls versus boys spaces, whether their parents allowed them to actually go somewhere, what chores they had, what places they were scared of, and then, of course, how they used social media and where they played their computer games. I found that boys in these communities were really independent, and they spent most of their time outside, on the streets, at the basketball court, or at the computer shop, whereas girls had a very smaller mobility range, and they really stayed right close to the home where they could watch after their siblings and kind of do their chores. I also found that there was a large presence of drugs and violence in the communities, and that really the children didn't have an expectation of safety. When I would ask them, what would you like to have in your community, most of them had an inability to be creative and to imagine anything different. Also, a lot of the families, as I said, didn't have job opportunities, and so a lot of the families ended up living, or the parents lived in the city and left their kids out in the community alone. So that only increased and kind of heightened this perception of fear. In India, I worked with about 30 adolescents in these in-depth interviews. Because India had a much more diverse, from caste diversity to religious diversity, I did not think that a focus group was appropriate. The kids wouldn't have been able to open up and actually talk to each other if I had had a focus group. So instead, I decided to, instead of recruiting 16 in-depth interview participants, I did 30 in-depth interview participants. A lot of the themes were the same. I'll just talk to you about the ones that were different. So in India, really no one talked about having to do chores. I was really surprised. Instead, it was about school. School had a huge weight on what the kids did, who they hung out with, where they went. And really, school was about this anticipation from parents about what you should be doing. And the whole family's success was based on school. So school was really the number one driver. The second was that I found there was a difference in walkability. In the communities I worked with in India, especially for girls, walking around outside was not acceptable, whereas in the Philippines, everybody walked everywhere, nobody cared. In addition to describing their spatial mobilities, I also then overlaid these maps on top of each other to find out the physical location of these third places, right, these hangouts. This was necessary because I found that the adolescents in the communities, again, they didn't go to the formal parks. So if I had started with a hypothesis, and I think this is kind of like my big takeaway, if I had started with a hypothesis and said, I'm going to analyze the formal public space in these communities, I would have missed it altogether. Because I would have presupposed that I knew that a park was a place that kids hang out. Instead, I went in and said, I don't know if kids even hang out. I'm going to just start talking to people. I'm going to just start learning about it. And then we're going to go from there. And so I ended up finding that this idea of third places were the hangouts, and they were not parks. They were streets, they were corners, they were abandoned lots. So discovering where these third places were, of course, I'm a nerd, I'm an architect, I can't help it. I couldn't just walk away and say like, okay, good, we know where they're at, awesome job, well done, let's graduate, now you can actually start to make money. No, I went in and said, but what are they like? I'm an architect, I want to know everything about these third spaces. I know how kids view them, but how do I view them as an architect, as a planning professional? So I started drilling into the third part of the project. One of the classes that I teach at the University of Oregon is called the Human Context of Design, which is all about how humans, how people actually use the space around us, right? And so we critique and comment on things like, wow, this is a really great auditorium, except it's impractical to think that other than these two wonderful people, anybody's going to sit on the floor because you can't really see, right? You don't want to arch your neck super far. So we kind of critique and study that type of architecture. So I felt like I was in a good position to analyze these communities, these third places, and ask questions about, what are the nature? Are they actually functioning as important spaces for everyone in the community and not just the kids? Maybe kids could be an indicator of where these cool hangout spaces are. So I used a ton, I know I'm getting a little long-winded, but I used a ton of data collection methods. I did behavior mapping and observations. I ended up with like 1,300 different behavior maps. So I would sit in each of these places over the course of several months. I mean, not sitting there for months, but a few hours, a few days a week, weekends, mornings, evenings, all that kind of stuff. And I developed a legend for each of the spaces that was kind of unique to that city. So in some, girls and boys were important, and others it might not have been. I also analyzed the spaces by doing these elevations and making GIS-based maps and diagrams. And then I also looked at this kind of criteria. So I modeled, I really love doing the design part of it. So I developed models of each of the spaces. There were about 23 in all spaces that I analyzed. And I rated them against these areas. So, who's going there? How are they moving about it? What activities and behaviors they're doing? What amenities does it have? Are there architectures that drive people away or bring people together? How are they marking territory? Is there universal accessibility or not? Where are the edges? Where are the nodes in the place? Is there positive space or negative space? And then is there the presence of nature? And then overall, what's the spirit? What's the essence? What feeling do I get when I go there? I ended up finding that, I think that these third places were really good indicators of what public space is actually used in practice. And I found several different transferable themes across. One was that there was this emphasis on transitory or threshold spaces versus actual destinations, so places that were on the way to something versus places that were I have to go there and that's my final destination. The second was the edge condition. Out of that whole list, the edge condition was really important. All of these places had a strong edge, which the people described as having more safety connotated with it. The third was that there was not a single space that was female dominated. They were almost all male dominated, and there were a few that had like equal populations of male and female. The fourth was that the places were almost always accessed by pedestrians. The fifth is that none had any features to support universal mobility. And then finally, that none of the places had any meaningful access to nature. Now, as somebody from Oregon, where we have beautiful nature and we have access to gorgeous ocean coast, I was really shocked by what I hadn't really seen before, which is that there isn't meaningful access to nature. Because for me, in my normal day-to-day, this is a picture along a bike trail that I take to work every day. In Oregon, nature is all around you. I kind of have taken it for granted. I just assume that everybody constantly kind of sees trees, et cetera. But I remembered this conversation that I had with a teacher in one of the communities where he said one of his biggest complaints is like, where can you actually watch the grandeur of the sunset? There's none of that in resettlement communities. And it was echoed by another kid that I worked with in India who said, essentially, well, there are no trees to just sit and have a place. Well, there are trees, but they're commandeered by people. They won't let us sit there. That means the local dads park their cars there, and they don't like the kids to play on them. Again, can you hear me now? Okay. Maybe this is a suggestion. I should wrap it up. So again, I'm drawing the point back to the fact that if I, as an architect, just started out by looking at the plans, I would have seen trees, I would have seen large agricultural areas wrapping around these resettlement communities and said, oh, there's plenty of nature, box checked. But if you investigate and you talk to the people, the nature that they really feel connected to is not present. So, this idea of public space in practice, it's not necessarily new. And there's a lot of different discourse that's been happening over the last decades, but I'm kind of arguing that maybe third places are a way that we can reconceptualize what are hangouts. And I do have to say, I found this guide. There's a UN Sustainable Development Goal guide that was just released last fall. It's called Public Space Site-Specific Assessment Guidelines to Achieve Quality Public Space at the Neighborhood Level. And I was giddy, guys, because I was like, I'm finishing up the dissertation. I'm trying to look for like a really sexy conclusion to point it all out. I've just looked at all these spaces, and I'm like, you know what I could do? This guide has just come out. I'm going to rate all 23 spaces against this guide, and I'm going to show how my hangout spaces that I've identified are really thriving space. It's going to be amazing. But what happened? I actually started rating it, and the questions were like, number of trash cans. There's no trash service. There's let alone a trash can. Number of street lights. Well, there's no street lights. How are the sidewalk conditions? Sidewalks, right? Like there's no sidewalks. It became really apparent very quickly that even though, and I hate to say it because as a user, the guide is really pretty. Like the graphic design is on point. It's very cool to use, but it's totally inappropriate for these type of dispossessed communities. So we need something else. Practitioners need something else. We need to stop presupposing Western design solutions like parks. We need to be listening more to the community, and we need to develop different tools and rating systems. So just to go in a little deeper and put the nail on the hammer on the nail, this is an example of one of the discrepancies that I found. In the UN guide, it says that there is access to public space for kids if that there is a public park within 300 meters of the home. But what I found when I actually, in GIS, ran the routes and areas of where the kids were going, I found that actually in this climate of fear, without the same type of parental involvement with the responsibility and the chores, These kids do not go far from their house. In fact, if you think, these are meters. So you're talking about like from one side of the room to the other side of the room, right? 30 meters is like 10 feet. They're not going far. Now, I want to just put an asterisk. I didn't do a survey. I didn't take population counts. What I'm doing is suggesting that there's more work to be done. I'm scratching the surface and telling you that I think I found an interesting stone. And if we as researchers get together, we could then implement more research and get to the bottom of it. But there's something here into the fact that kids' mobilities are very different and very restricted. And the current guidance we have isn't meeting the mark. And again, driving home, the idea of these Western design concepts being applied with good intention. For example, sidewalks were designed in all of the resettlement communities in the Philippines. But none of the sidewalks were actually used as a sidewalk. In fact, all of the houses had been modified to enclose the sidewalk as part of the space of the house. Now, the houses were, in my very educated words, stupidly small, right? They were like, I think about 200 square feet for a family average of 6 to 7 people. So one room, kind of one bathroom. If you were living in a house, would you prefer to have that small with 7 of your brothers and sisters and your aunts and your uncles and your parents? Do you want a sidewalk? Or do you want a little more space that you can maybe have some privacy, right? So I think there's a failure in presupposing we know the solutions without actually talking to people and getting their story. So I'm advocating for a collaborative approach other than just using standard Westland template designs. And I'm trying to show that third places are critical sites of public space in practice, rather than like this additive approach where we conceive public space as like a bounded park. I think that this idea of third spaces in practice have the ability to promote equity. And I'd like to really conclude the presentation by summarizing some of the key points and leaving you with the overall major findings. So at the heart of Karen Malone's statement, there's a relationship between children's experiences and their well-being in urban environments and the sustainability overall of our cities. And she continues by reinforcing the local environment or the neighborhood as really being like a fundamental part of children's everyday experience. And there's other scholars that have said, if children safely and satisfactorily engage with urban neighborhoods, their independence, their mobility, their resilience, and social competence are enhanced, and society at large benefits. So children, especially in the age of adolescence, they need these varying opportunities. They need these hangouts, these third places to be able to play, to have physical activity, to have social interaction, and to develop their physical, their cognitive, and their social skills. So even though we know that research is clear, I think that our urban design and planning practices have been really slow to take into account the specific needs of adolescents, while simultaneously neoliberal policies and processes are eroding the neighborhood environments in these dispossessed communities. So I would say that dispossessed communities are like hotspots, and they're at high environmental risk for adolescents who already have social and economic burdens to deal with. Again, Michael Cernia pointed out that the World Bank is rolling back the previous requirements that we had that were supposed to keep those social programs and environmental programs in check. So right now we have a perfect storm brewing. We have a lot of work happening on one side taking over, and then the protections are gone. The gate is let down, it's unlocked and opened. I think architects and planners need to take the initiative to be able to step in, because we know, we've studied it, we know the history, we're the ones who are coming in as the educated practitioners, and we need to be the ones to step in and intervene. It is our responsibility to protect the health, safety, and welfare of people, of humans. I also want to add a little bit about girls. I think girls are a critical pressure point to identify these third places because of their unique position in the community. A lot of adults are really not even aware of the power systems that are around them, right? They've already normalized it. They don't question it. But adolescents, and particularly girls, they're the ones that are like, wait, what? I'm supposed to do what? Huh? That isn't fair. I don't like that. That doesn't feel good. So they're the ones that are gonna be the canaries. They're the ones that are going to actually suggest it and make something of it. So as you can see, I think in this little kind of interview quote between research assistant Mia and Lay, she really, she says multiple times, they keep telling me I'm a girl as if that's a justification for why I can't go play, right? That's what she's saying. I don't get it. Why does it matter? It hasn't mattered before. So I think if we draw on subaltern studies, feminist, or standpoint theory, I think that adolescent girls' voices could be the most important voice if the goal is equity in public space, or the goal is equity in truly meaningful public space like hangouts, then maybe it's the adolescent girls that we should be talking to first when architects and planners start to engage. I think that we should be working with them to understand those power structures. The design strategies should be context and site specific. For example, in Nanakrem Guda, the community with the billboard, the most equitable third places were residential streets. And design strategies then to upgrade those third hangout spaces, they could include things like street lighting, or creating shading devices, or putting the sewage underground, because the girls are gonna want to stay close to their home, rather than creating a centralized park 300 meters away. So I hope, in big picture conclusion, I started my project with this idea that I was gonna connect neoliberal policies, this thing like really high above, and I was gonna connect it down to specific architectures. And I had to do that using some kind of innovative stakes and measures, but I think that I was able to show that maybe adolescent girls are the people that we need to listen to, and that they may hold the key for our future success in making space more equitable. Thanks.
Just asked Alexis to go see if we have another microphone, but we're going to just pass it back and forth for a little bit. Thank you so much, Dr. Deaton, for that remarkable presentation of research. I love your mix of different methods, the different ways that you engaged with youth, and all the different skills that you marshaled through all of your experiences to put together this set of research and the progression of that. Oftentimes our presenters are very much sharing their research as if it is a conference talk, and I appreciate the extent to which you took time to really teach people about how research is conducted and the experiences that you go through for that. I'm going to open it up for Q&A, so those of you who have questions, please come up, because we won't be able to walk back and forth with the mics so much. But while I invite you to come down with questions, let me just open with a couple that came to my mind when I was listening to you talk. So much of the results that you shared, I think we have decades of experience, not just for dispossessed communities, but fully possessed communities. I'm thinking William White's work, where he did observations of parks in New York City. And it showed that people aren't there in this giant space. They're always there in the 100% corner. They like to be where everybody else is, where there's no space, because people like people. They like to be where they can see. They like to have these objects where they can sit and they can look. Or thinking about Jane Jacobs, the eyes on the street, those kinds of shapes, all of that visual access, it was in the parks. Or connecting it to Annette Kim's work in Vietnam, where she showed the places that people actually use in Ho Chi Minh City or in Hanoi. It's not the big green parks that people have created. It's like expressly they do not want to sit on the grass. They are not Frisbee players. They are not picnic goers. The way people there eat, they congregate, they eat, they snack, and people chat. Or you're thinking about the Filipino workers in Hong Kong. They are gathering in these spaces of like subway corridors, because that's the only place on Sundays on their day off that they can have off. So we have like such a long history of people knowing that if you care about how humans actually behave, there is a different kind of design. And yet architects especially, I would say, just don't seem to really care about human behavior in their design. And you noted the room, you observed astutely that Nathan and I, who are sitting in the front, we are craning our necks to see you. And this is a Remcool House auditorium. And he designed this, and the reason that the seating is pushed so far back is because the Board of Trustees expressly wanted to be able to meet in this auditorium when they have their annual meeting. So you'll notice these holes in the ground, they actually reveal couches that come up, big plush seating, so that the board can have a meeting here. And this is why our auditoriums are pushed so far back. They can't actually hear in this room either. And so ultimately the board meets in the Johnson Art Museum and they don't even come here. So how do we change fundamentally architecture and then also by extension the urban design components of planning to center people, any person, much less an adolescent girl in a dispossessed slum community of the Global South?
Yeah. Wow, that's a powerful question and an intense one. I definitely, I guess I have a few thoughts about it. I don't pretend to have the answers. I sure wish I did, though. I think that for me personally, that's a huge reason why even though I'm devoted to education, I think it's super important to keep one foot in practice, because I think if we get too boxed into the theory, it's not that we forget who we're designing for, it's that I think too quickly we think we know the answers. It's that too quickly we kind of assume that, oh, I can read this book or I can watch a few videos, and then somehow that gives me the privilege of understanding how people in this community are going to act. And so I would say that we need a cultural shift within the profession to respect or to find value in knowing that you don't know. And also we need to be prioritizing collaborative work. And Dr. Warner's in the audience, and I had met with her yesterday. And one of the things that we talked about was how difficult it is to move discourse when it's not sexy. Specifically, I think work with kids and adolescents right now is not, unfortunately, that interesting or popular. And so when you're actually trying to create inroads to that, she gave a great suggestion of really relying on practitioners and relying on professional organizations, almost in a grassroots way, to make that change happen. So one of the things that I have been doing, and this is a shameless plug, apologies, but as I started the Humanitarian Planning Committee, which essentially it's part of the American Planning Association. If you guys are students, it's free for you guys to join it. But our main goal is to advocate that architects and planners need to be on the teams that go in to do these projects. That every time that there's a development project sponsored by the World Bank or a local government, it must contain a requirement to have an urban design analysis, a planning analysis, an architectural analysis with the community. And I think that until the people funding the projects starts to see the value in that, it's going to be really difficult, just because of the world. I don't necessarily agree with the rules of the game, but because of how the game is structured, I think we've got to figure out how to make it happen in practice, and then we use the grassroots practice to drive a change in the theory and in the institution overall. Is that fair? Okay.
Now, since she ended on a note about the importance of centering adolescent females, I would like for women today to ask some questions. Strategy, I see a gender divide, and who actually asks questions. So you could not find a more welcoming speaker to ask questions with. I'd like to extend a special invitation to the ladies in the audience to participate in asking questions. There will also be a talk back afterwards, because I know many of you prefer these smaller settings, and you can engage with her in a smaller discussion after this. We have a line for you.
Sorry, is this working? Yeah. Sorry. Professor Deaton, thank you so much for coming today. As a fellow Oregonian, it's really nice to see other people from the state here, and great to see people from UFO. I really appreciate your focus on the practical over the theoretical in this presentation. I feel sometimes in my classes like we get so focused on theory and like the history of planning that we don't focus on like how to actually carry it out. And I guess like the question I have is sort of like, you talked a lot in this about like stuff you talked a lot in this presentation about stuff you didn't do like in normal planning practice. I guess sort of like what are some takeaways you have from this long process process and research you've been going through about how like the data gathering phase of the practice of urban planning can be better conducted, whether in these sorts of communities or in other kinds of communities?
To clarify, do you mean like if you were to put it into like a practice project, or are you talking about like how I did it in the research?
I guess sort of like in the more abstract sort of like practice project way. Like, what are some things that you think would be transferable to any other
Totally.
any kind of like project?
Well, that's a great question and segue. So thank you for that. I think there's kind of two things that I want to say on it. One is I had a really good opportunity when I was able to kind of like intern or work for Save the Children, almost in like an embedded ethnographic approach, because I was working, as I said, on their project as a researcher to kind of learn how they were doing it, but also to build connections for my project. And they had an actual funded project. It was a 5-year study where the first year of the study, 6 months was for research, 6 months was for design. Now, everybody out here who does any kind of ethnographic work is like, ha, like 6 months, like what is that, is that really your meaningful, in-depth, saturated engagement? No, but it's a start, right? Somebody funded it. Somebody funded research. It's shocking, but they found a value to it. And I think that if we could build on those kind of models where part of the project is actually including research as the phase, the research part and then the design part before you get into implementation, that would be really important. The second part of it, so I do work as a practicing architect and planner. I work for a company called the Urban Collaborative, and then I just started a company called the International Development Collaborative. And in both of those roles, it's hard. It's a day-to-day fight. There are customers that I work with that they're the customer. They know what they want. They are not going to be told, and it's a door. And you take those I'm being realistic here. You take those projects because you're keeping your staff employed. You take those projects because you have to keep the door open. But you never stop advocating, and you never stop educating. And I think that's a huge thing that the Urban Collaborative and the International Development Collaborative, both companies do, that's pretty untraditional, is if you look at the website or anything, we consider ourselves to be educators first. We only do collaborative architecture and planning, so we never go in. We've had multiple requests for clients to say, we want you to value engineer your budget. You don't need to come on site. You can do one site walkthrough and then go back to your office, come up with like 2 or 3 preferred two alternatives, and then we'll review it and we'll tell you which one we like, and then you can design it. And we have said, no, we will not do that work. Our standard process, whether we're doing a comprehensive master plan or we're doing a conceptual design for a building, is we start out with at least 1 week on site. We go to their office, we conduct preliminary interviews in advance, we review all the interviews, we analyze them, and then we come on site and we reorganize the room, we put all the tables together, we bring out big trace paper, we bring kits of markers for people to actually work with, and we sit down and say, okay, class has started. We're going to show you a little bit about what the design process is. And I literally start by giving a PowerPoint presentation about best practices in design. And we do data collection methods with them, although we call them games so people don't know, because a lot of people don't like the idea of research. So we'll play what we call a visual preference game, where we'll show them images of different types of buildings, and we'll collect information about which ones they like or what type of aesthetic they have. And then we sit down at the tables and we actually that sounds bad. We encourage our clients to pick up the pen and start drawing. Now, of course, we take it back and we throw it in Revit and Grasshopper and we make videos and it looks really cool. But what it does is it creates a sense of ownership. When somebody has to learn about the design process and then pick up a pen, their mentality completely shifts, most of the time. And when they do that, I think they start to realize the importance, and they start to realize the types of conclusions that we as designers are being asked to draw, And I think that what we do is come at it from this humble perspective that, look, we've got the background history and we know the process, but there's never going to be anybody more educated about your project than the people that are living and working there. And so if they can be the ones to pick up the pen and draw the solution for you, I think that's much more powerful than us presupposing that solution.
All right, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Doctor, so much for your presentation. I resonate with much of your work, like as a researcher and practitioner myself, who has also worked with children for many years in Spain before coming here. I also realized that in the US, children are often absent from the conversation. It was great to see. I'm going to ask a little, maybe provocative question here, also because I do very similar work to you, so I'm very curious to hear what you think. So it seems that adolescents are already creating or producing the spaces where they hang out without us external planners, architects intervening in those places. So why not leaving them alone and just let them do their own spaces, especially if we haven't been invited to intervene, because it seems to me that as researchers or practitioners, we pick case studies that serve our research interests, but then we are kind of disrupting the spaces that have been already created. So what's your take on that?
It's like in a way almost like a chicken or an egg question, right? Like if we do research on things the way they are, but then we change it, how do we know that it's necessarily like even going to be for the better or that it's even going to be wanted? So we don't know. But what I can say is I think children consistently don't have a voice in the process, whereas adults traditionally do. And so I think that there could be opportunities, again, coming back to the principle of only the people that live and use the space know what's going to work for them. I don't think that, I think that children will eventually, how do I say this? Children will always have needs to support their development, their socialization, but unlike an environment or a community that will slowly adapt over time to be what the adults need it to be, children never have that seat at the table. So I don't know that over time, any community with a presupposed design idea is going to adapt to meet children's needs because they just don't have a voice. And so I do think that maybe that's the role of researchers, right? Or designers or planners and practitioners is to say, whether it's we're designing from the get-go communities that meet the needs, or we're helping adapt communities that have failed designs to meet their needs, somebody needs to be representing the needs of children because they're not able to do it themselves. And I don't have well, maybe I do. I actually think I can show you a slide. Oh, maybe not. Let's see. I have an image. It was a hidden slide. Oh. I can't get it to unhide. Okay, well, maybe later. Oh, wait, you can see it. Never mind. Okay, so this slide here. Oh, no, it's there. Okay, so this is Pabahai 2000. This is one of the communities I worked with in the Philippines. This is how it was designed in 1998. And my point in this slide was that the planning framework doesn't really change, right? That like the roads, the streets, that's gonna stay the same pretty much unless you have like a cataclysmic event, because it's super hard to change that stuff. But if you were to walk around on the street here when it was built, all you would see is the exact same house replicated, the same way. Concrete, a tin roof, single room on every single street. If you were to come back in 2020 and walk around, it would not be like that at all. It would be 3-story hotels. You would see schools. You would see daycare centers, meat markets, banana shops, right? There would be all sorts of different architecture, even though they kind of follow the same overall morphology. That's because what your point was, I don't want to be too simplistic, but it's almost like Jurassic Park, right? Like life will find a way. Like eventually, this community that, I don't know the architect, but I think the design sucks, is going to be what the people need it to be, because over time, they're going to have ownership. But tell me the point where kids got to vote. Tell me the point where the kids actually got to help make that. They don't. And that's where I think we have to do something.
Hi, Dr. Deaton. First, I want to say I really appreciate your work, your very detailed research, your patience of staying in a country for many years. That's really remarkable for me. First, during the whole process of your, great presentation, I keep thinking of what we've recently read about the fragments, the fragments theory, Benjamin or McFarlane proposed to see this the third place as a fragment of city, as marginal parts of the city, and and also when McFarlane talks about the power of the fragments, it occurs to me about your research. So my question would be what's the epistemological implication of your research? Because I kind of wonder your attitude towards, it's kind of like Antonio's question, it's kind of make me wonder your attitude towards this third place. So do you consider it's more of a resistant power, like it is a resistant power to against our imagination of a certain kind of urban, or against children's imagination of how they can be raised? Or do you still consider it as a very contested, unequal space that carries the presumptions like what you talk about inequality of gender or something like that? I kind of wonder your attitude. Thanks.
Okay, there's a lot in that. I think I would go back to saying my attitude towards these third places is a little conflicted. A lot because of what the previous student before you had said of I'm not sure that we can necessarily, again, I'm kind of going in before the design before a better alternative has been released and making suggestions, right? I'm in essence asking questions. So I think my attitude towards a future possibility or an imagined, right, world in which adolescents have supportive interstitial hangouts or third spaces, I'm hopeful. I'm also very cautious. I don't know that I don't know that we as designers and planners know enough about the situation to know right now how to put in those places. I also think that a lot of times we design things in terms of destinations, not necessarily. So we design an additive, we design something to be the final result and to stand alone. And I think we lose out on connective tissues, malleability, and people's ability to take ownership and make the space their own. I think that especially when it comes to girls, it's going to be really difficult to understand how we can create spaces that allow for gender equity. And I don't know what those solutions would look like. It's super difficult to make any kind of summary or analysis of it. I feel like we should chat more about it because I have some questions back to you on the fracturing of it, but yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for coming today. My career has been working specifically with adolescent girls through Girl Scouts up until last year. And something that we focus very much on in leadership development with girls is for them to be able to identify problems in the community and find their way to take action with it. So I want to ask you about kind of two different ideas. The idea of what you've mentioned about getting girls involved and getting children involved in the decision and design part of this at that phase, but also the phase of once girls have identified these are our third places, these are the places that we go, what are the opportunities for girls to make an impact in those spaces that they've already claimed from what has been designed? And do you see practical ways to get girls involved during either one of those phases?
What a great question. And I'm going to answer the second part of that first and say, actually, I don't. I don't want to be too, simplistic, and I wish I had the answer, but I actually don't know. I think my research has been more focused on bringing attention to the fact that girls need a seat at the table and that their voice could be important. But when it comes to how girls are going to do that, I would defer to one of my colleagues, Ruchi Varna, who has a really amazing project. She's a practitioner. She focuses exclusively on engagement and participatory ways for kids in India, but she's actually won a whole slew of awards and has transferred her model internationally. Also, the people at Save the Children that I worked with had really great participatory strategies. I think to me the challenge though comes, and I feel like I'm about to shoot myself in the foot, so apologies, but I do think that part of the challenge comes when we put too much importance on the value of architecture alone, right? Like there's been a pendulum swinging in education and in discourse about everything's about the environment, it's like the coolest, most important thing, environment behavior relations are amazing, to no, really, architecture and the environment is meaningless. It's all about society and social relations and the economy, et cetera. And I think we're kind of hopefully maybe swinging back to the middle. I do think architecture is incredibly important, but especially when it comes to the voice of kids, I don't know that adding a bench or a street light is going to bring girls out to the street, right? That's going to have to come from a social change within the community, between an allowed space, about the vectors of power happening with the community. So not that I don't, I think the work is important, and it's important to still make progress. I see that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. I see that there is a world that we could live in which adolescent girls have safe, supportive spaces. I don't know the exact course of how to get there. And I also don't know the magnanimity of architecture's role or the built environment's role in that. I do know that it's undervalued right now, but I don't think it's the whole solution.
Thank you, Lyndsey, and welcome. I'm Nima, so I know Louise really well, so thank you. Thank you for coming in. So you've done an amazing amount of work. Louise talked about it, and I just didn't believe her. And then I'm seeing everything you did, and I'm like, oh my God, okay. So that's so congratulations, I guess, because it's so amazing. We're all hovering around the same question, it seems to me, and I'm thinking of Tony's question, Hantao's question, and the one that I'm going to ask you, right? About this business of uncovering spaces, of wanting to make things visible, because we think that's how we want to deal with fear, and that's how we want to deal with being, equitable and accessible, right? I'm also thinking about the 1995 Growing Up in Cities project in Bangalore, which I was a part of when I was a doctoral student and a practitioner. And so that Satyanagar project was so interesting because in the last 3 or 4 days of research work was when we truly found where the kids were playing. And it wasn't, and the project had been going on for 14 months with local researchers speaking local languages, right? Like you were trying, without us being there always, because it changes what happens. And like I said, it wasn't until that last week when we found the places, and it was in a gully that was hidden from adults in the kinds of spaces you were talking about. Lots of open spaces in these cities, and how they're used and what happens really changes. What's striking to me is Bangalore of 1995 was, of course, neoliberalizing. India had opened up just 3 years before that, but it was a very different time than what you're talking about. And so what's, I think, turning Tony's and Hantao's questions around, going back to what you were talking about originally, the range of the kids that we were working with in Bangalore was way more than what you have. So there's something happening. So I think what's interesting to me is in your conversation, you moved away from that question of neoliberalness. And I'm wondering if you can go back to that. Go back to that piece of it and wonder what's happening to Indian cities. That children are not ranging free like they did before, making spaces in the gullies. And there were girls and boys in those spaces. They were younger, And gendering starts much more strongly in the age group that you're looking at, of course. So I'm very curious about that, you know, because there's something about the ways in which the city works now, and you're looking at it, what, 15 years after the last Growing Up in Cities project round. So very curious to hear your take on that.
I do think the city is obviously very different, and you're echoing sentiments that I heard. So in addition to interviewing, I really focused my primary data on these in-depth interviews with children. That was the focus. But to give the research credibility and trustworthiness and rigor, I also did interviews with parents in the community, teachers, policymakers, et cetera, and tried to really get a bigger perspective so that I could kind of like validate some things. But through those, I actually heard a lot of fear embedded in a lot of the community advocates and the teachers' narratives that echo what you're saying about when we lived here, when our parents lived in this community, when, 15, 20, 30 years ago, we had access to not necessarily, again, formal spaces, but we felt freer to use the agricultural field next to us. But today, even though it's there, the kids don't go play there. And I think that there are different forces. They're very neoliberal and globalized forces. I think that there's a huge impact of social media. One of the kind of funny asides, when I started the project in working with Save the Children, I sent them a notice, here's what I'm gonna do, here's my protocol, can you run it through your ethics board? And they were like, oh, on line 7, you say you're going to see what social media accounts the kids are using, but you don't need to do it. They're not on social media because these kids, you don't understand the level of poverty. They don't have access to it. And I was like, you'd be surprised. And we kind of fought about it. And finally they were like, all right, we'll do a focus group and we'll see. Every kid either had their own cell phone, or they accessed their parents' cell phone, or they went to a local computer shop that mom or dad didn't maybe not know about, but every kid was on Facebook. Facebook was the number one thing. And I think there's something that relates back to neoliberal ideology about Facebook's malleability and ability to represent these kids' lives in the ways that they can control. They show pictures of them in the shopping mall, standing in front of a popular store rather than in their own community. And they get really invested in kind of this separate identity that they have. And I think that they spend a lot of their time and a lot of their focus, a lot of their extra energy in those spaces. So rather than meeting their social needs, and this is a lot of speculation, just kind of based on interviews to answer your question, my project was slightly different, but I think based on all the interviews that I did with the kids, a lot of them felt like their social needs were strongly tied to the representation of themselves on Facebook and how they interacted with other kids on Facebook. And in a way, it seems like they preferred it because they had that control than just getting their social needs met by hanging out with other people physically in person in a space. And so you have this competition where I do think neoliberal forces segregating, all of a sudden public spaces are not, well, maybe not all of a sudden, but a lot of these public spaces are being segregated by class. You have a lot more gated communities. You have restrictions to being able to go into the mall, for example. It means that the lower income kids are not allowed into those spaces, and they're having to find other spaces that are less safe. So the spaces that they are into are less safe or more dangerous. And there's higher risk, or they could use social media and they could stay closer to their house. And so I think, to me, I think that off the cusp, that would be one of the major disparities, and that's one of the kind of larger influence of the neoliberalism that's impacting these places, especially in India.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful, actually. Yeah, just adding a small thing. We had a master's student 2 years ago, a year ago, I can't remember now, who did a wonderful project in just the next village over from where you are. Oh. It's a place called Gauli, also with Hyderabad Urban Lab. So what she shows in her work, which I think really reflects back in terms of how Indian cities are changing, particularly so social media is one part of it, but her work is also indicating how many outsiders are coming in. So the place is not your own anymore, right? And it's, of course, they're still Indian, but there's a very huge diversity of language and of everything else. It's completely different people and cultures. And so so it seems to me that a real big piece of your project is that, and the transformation of the Indian city in the last 50 years.